Marcus has been writing higher education copy for 6 years. He's good at it, or so he's been told. His headlines are clean. His program descriptions are structured and easy to read. His email sequences follow the frameworks he learned at his first agency. His conversion rates, by any industry benchmark he can find, are unremarkable. He's sitting in a briefing meeting at a mid-sized UK university. The head of marketing is explaining a new postgraduate campaign targeting international applicants from Nigeria and Ghana. The target audience, she says, is ambitious young professionals between 25 and 32, typically with 3 to 5 years of work experience, seeking a career step change through a UK master's degree. Marcus nods. He's written this audience before. He knows the tone, aspirational but grounded, outcome-focused, internationally aware. He starts drafting the headline in his head before the meeting even ends. 3 weeks later, the campaign goes live. The click-through rate is adequate. The inquiry conversion is poor. The head of marketing asks what went wrong. Marcus doesn't know. His copy was technically proficient. It addressed the right themes. It used the right register. It just didn't convert. Here's what Marcus didn't do before writing a single word. He didn't talk to anyone from Nigeria or Ghana who had recently applied to a UK postgraduate program. He didn't read the forums where these applicants discuss their actual concerns. He didn't review the questions people ask in WhatsApp groups dedicated to UK visa applications. He didn't look at the threads where people describe exactly what made them choose one institution over another. He wrote what he thought this audience needed to hear. He didn't write what they were already saying to each other. That difference is what this entire chapter is about. And it's not a small difference, it's usually the single biggest gap between copy that performs and copy that doesn't. Quick note before we continue. This video covers Chapter 3 of my book, The Science of Persuasive Copy, which builds on the risk reduction framework from Episode 1 and the dual process psychology from Episode 2. If you haven't seen those yet, I'd recommend starting there, though this chapter stands fine on its own too. Links to the full book are in the description if you want the complete research templates and exercises. Let's get into it. In 1981, the psychologist Robert Cialdini documented something he called the principle of liking, the consistent finding that people are more easily persuaded by those they perceive as similar to themselves. Linguistic mirroring, using the specific words, phrases, and frameworks that a person already uses to describe their own experience, is one of the most powerful activation mechanisms for that principle. Here's what actually happens in the reader's mind. When a prospective student reads copy that uses the exact language they already use internally to describe their own situation, a recognition response fires in the brain. It's not a conscious process. It feels, to the reader, like the copy is somehow about them, as if whoever wrote it understands them personally. That feeling generates trust faster and more durably than any credential or ranking ever could. The inverse is just as powerful, and just as consistent. When copy uses language that doesn't match the reader's internal experience, when it uses institutional vocabulary where the student uses emotional vocabulary, when it describes outcomes in professional jargon where the student describes them in deeply personal terms, the reader experiences a subtle but decisive sense of distance. The copy isn't wrong, exactly. It's just not theirs. And copy that doesn't feel like yours doesn't convert, no matter how well it's constructed. This is the language gap, and it's persistent and well documented across the entire sector. Institutions write in the language of the institution. Students think, and speak, in the language of the decision. These are not the same language, and the gap between them is the primary reason technically competent copy consistently underperforms. Let me show you exactly what that gap looks like, side by side, because once you see it you'll start noticing it everywhere. Take academic quality. The institution writes, internationally recognized faculty. The student is actually thinking, will I learn things I can use? Take career outcomes. The institution writes, strong graduate employability profile across global industries. The student is thinking, will this degree get me the job? What do people actually do after this? Take financial investment. The institution writes, competitive tuition structure with scholarship opportunities. The student is thinking, can I justify this to my family? What if the return on investment doesn't materialize? Take international experience. The institution writes, diverse and vibrant international campus community. The student is thinking, will I feel like an outsider? Will anyone actually help me settle in? And take institutional reputation. The institution writes, globally recognized institution with a strong research profile. The student is thinking, simply, will employers in my country have even heard of this university? Notice the pattern. In every single row, the institution is describing itself, in its own internal vocabulary, while the student is asking a direct, personal, often anxious question in completely different language. Voice of customer research is the systematic process of closing that exact gap, of replacing institutional language with the authentic vocabulary of the people you're actually trying to reach, so your copy produces the recognition response instead of the distance response. Here's a way to think about this that I'd encourage you to hold on to. Your audience is already talking about the decision you want to influence. They're having this conversation right now, somewhere, without you. Your job isn't to invent persuasive language from scratch. It's to find where that conversation is happening, listen more carefully than anyone else bothers to, and write back to them in their own words. This brings us to the framework for this chapter, the voice of customer research system. This is a structured, four-stage methodology for gathering, organizing, and deploying authentic audience language in higher education copy. It doesn't require a large research budget or a specialist research team. It requires structured attention, systematic organization, and the discipline to prioritize what your audience is actually saying over what your institution wants to say. The four stages are listen, categorize, extract, and deploy. Each stage builds directly on the one before it, and skipping a stage produces copy that sounds like it was informed by research, without actually being informed by anything real. Let's start with stage 1, listen. Before you can use authentic student language, you have to actually find it. And reliable voice of customer data for higher education exists in a fairly small number of consistently rich locations. The single highest value source is qualitative interviews with recent applicants and enrolled students. Nothing replaces a direct conversation with someone who has recently made the exact decision you're writing about. A 20-minute structured interview with 5 to 10 recent applicants, both the ones who enrolled and the ones who didn't, will produce more usable language than almost any amount of secondary research you could gather instead. And the interview doesn't need to be elaborate. The questions that consistently produce the most usable copy language are remarkably consistent across contexts. Walk me through the moment you first started seriously considering this program. What were you thinking about right then? What were you most worried about while you were making this decision? What almost stopped you from applying? What was the one thing that made you feel confident enough to actually go ahead? How did you explain your decision to your family, or to the people close to you? And if you were advising someone else in exactly your position, what would you tell them? Those questions are designed to surface the emotional architecture underneath the decision, the fears, the triggers, the specific language of persuasion and reassurance that the person used with themselves. Record every interview if you can. Transcribe every response. The specific words matter far more than the general themes you might be tempted to summarize them into. The second major source is online forums and community platforms. Prospective students discuss their higher education decisions at considerable length in public forums, and the language they use in these conversations is some of the most reliable voice of customer data available anywhere. For UK, US, Canadian, and Australian audiences, the major platforms include dedicated student forums, relevant subreddits built around applications and visas, Quora threads, and Facebook groups built around specific visa categories or national student communities. For international applicant audiences specifically, particularly from South Asia, West Africa, and Southeast Asia, WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, and country-specific forums are the highest value sources of all. These communities are where prospective students ask the questions they're genuinely afraid to ask an official admissions office, which makes them an unmatched source of authentic fear language, objection language, and decision trigger language. Doing this systematically means identifying the 5 to 10 highest traffic threads related to your specific program or institution type, reading through every post in those threads, and extracting every phrase that describes a fear, a doubt, a decision criterion, or a positive trigger that pushed someone towards saying yes. The volume of available data is genuinely substantial. The actual discipline required is in the extraction and the organization that follows, which is exactly what Stage 2 addresses. The third source, and one that's almost always sitting completely unused, is your own institutional data, enquiry forms, live chat transcripts, and admissions emails. Every single question a prospective student asks your institution directly is a piece of voice of customer data. Admissions teams receive the same handful of questions repeatedly, in slightly different phrasing, from applicants at different stages of their decision journey. These questions are the exact language of doubt and decision, and they're typically sitting unread in an inbox or a CRM system that nobody on the marketing team has ever actually opened. A structured review of 3 to 6 months of admissions enquiry data, looking specifically for patterns in the questions being asked and the language being used, will produce a more accurate picture of your audience's actual decision psychology than most formal research projects manage to produce, often at zero additional cost. There's also a valuable secondary source worth mentioning: review platforms and alumni feedback. Review sites and university-specific review aggregators provide authentic student language that's particularly useful for two things: extracting the specific language students use to describe positive outcomes, which can be repurposed directly as benefit language, and extracting the language they use to describe negative experiences, which reveals precisely the fears your copy needs to preemptively address. Read the 1-star reviews and the 5-star reviews with equal attention. Both contain genuinely usable copy material. Once you've listened, you move to Stage 2, categorize. Raw voice of customer data isn't immediately usable in its raw form. It has to be organized into categories that map directly onto the copy decisions you'll actually need to make. The system uses 5 standard categories, and each one corresponds directly to a specific copy function. The first, and most valuable, is fear language, every phrase that describes a worry, a doubt, a risk, or a potential negative outcome. This category tells you exactly what your copy has to address before it can do any persuading at all. From real international postgraduate research, phrases like, "What if the degree isn't recognized back home?" or "I'm scared of wasting 3 years if the career outcomes aren't what they promise," or "My parents will never forgive me if this doesn't work out." Notice how specific and how emotionally loaded that language is, compared to the institutional phrase, "competitive tuition structure," from a moment ago. That's the gap, made completely visible. The second category is decision trigger language, the specific phrases people use to describe what actually convinced them, the moment something clicked from uncertain to confident. The third is outcome language, how people describe success in their own words, often far more specific and personal than any official employability statistic. The fourth is identity language, the way people talk about who they're trying to become through this decision, not what they're trying to acquire. And the fifth is comparison language, the specific criteria people use, in their own words, when weighing one institution against another. Once your data is sorted into these 5 categories, stage 3 is extract, pulling out the specific phrases, not paraphrased summaries, that appear repeatedly across multiple sources. If 3 different forum threads and 2 different interview subjects all independently describe the same fear in similar language, that's a strong signal you found something structurally important to your audience, not just one person's individual phrasing. And stage 4 is deploy, the actual work of writing that fear language, that decision trigger language, that identity language, directly into your copy, in close to its original form. Not polished into institutional vocabulary. Not smoothed over into something that sounds more professional. The whole value of this method collapses the moment you translate authentic language back into the institutional register it was specifically meant to replace. Let's bring this back to Marcus for a moment, because his story isn't really about a failed campaign, it's about a missing step. If Marcus had spent even a few hours doing stage 1 properly, reading the actual WhatsApp groups and forum threads where his exact target audience, ambitious Nigerian and Ghanaian professionals weighing a UK master's degree, were already discussing this decision in their own words, his headline would very likely have looked nothing like the one he drafted in his head before the meeting even ended. It probably wouldn't have used the word step change at all. It probably would have used whatever specific phrase the audience actually uses to describe the exact fear of investing years and savings into a qualification that doesn't deliver what it promises. That one shift, from writing what you assume your audience needs to hear, to writing what they're already saying to each other, is the entire mechanism behind voice of customer research. It's not a creative technique. It's closer to translation work, except instead of translating between 2 languages, you're translating between institutional vocabulary and lived human vocabulary, and only one of those 2 actually converts. If you're finding value in this series, take a moment to subscribe, because Chapter 4 builds directly on this research methodology, looking at exactly how to take this authentic language and structure it into a complete campaign architecture. Let's close this chapter out. Enrollment decisions are made by real people, using their own internal vocabulary to process a decision that's frightening, significant, and unfamiliar. Most institutional copy is written in an entirely different vocabulary, polished, accurate, and quietly unconvincing, because it never bothered to listen first. Voice of customer research isn't an optional research step you do if budget allows, it's the foundation that determines whether every framework from the first 2 episodes in this series even has a chance to work. Risk reduction architecture and dual process sequencing only function correctly when they're built using the actual language your audience uses to experience risk and make decisions. Without that authentic language underneath it, even a technically perfect framework is just an empty structure. If you'd like the complete version of this chapter, including the full research templates, the complete categorization system, and the implementation exercises that walk you through building your own voice of customer research process step by step, the book this series is based on, The Science of Persuasive Copy, is linked in the description below. It's available on Barnes & Noble, on Everand, and through Thalia. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Get the full book, The Science of Persuasive Copy, by Mujahid Baber. Everand. https://www.everand.com/book/101084084085/the. Thalia. This video covers Chapter 3, Voice of Customer Research. The full chapter includes the complete research templates, categorization system, and implementation exercises not covered in this video.